Go to Mark chapter 6, verse 3. Read it the way you would read any other sentence in any other book, not with the commentary your pastor gave you, not with the Sunday school explanation already running in your head before you even reach the words. Just the words on the page, the way they sit there. Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James, and Joses, and of Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? 4 names: James, Joses, Simon, Judas. And sisters, plural, unnamed, still living in the same town, apparently well known enough that the crowd can mention them without identifying them further. I want you to hold those 4 names for a moment, not move past them, not reach for the explanation. Just let them sit on the page where they have been sitting for 2,000 years. Every major English translation of the Bible renders that word as brothers. The King James, the New International Version, the English Standard Version, the New American Standard. And Matthew chapter 13 verse 55 names all 4 of them again. Same order, same Greek word, same unambiguous statement. These are his brothers. 2 Gospels, 4 brothers, named, specific. Your church calls them cousins. The word in your Bible does not say cousin. It never did. Now here is what I want to show you today. Not because I take pleasure in unsettling what people believe, and not because any of this is hidden in some archive most people cannot access. I want to show you because the revision is documented. The man who changed the reading has a name. The year he did it is on record. The reason he did it is written in his own hand. What happened to the brothers of Jesus is not a mystery wrapped in ancient ambiguity. It is a history with a specific author and a specific date and a specific motive. And it is right there in the texts, if you are willing to read them the way Spinoza taught. Follow what the document actually says, track when a reading changed and who changed it and why, and let the internal evidence take precedence over what the institution needs it to mean. The word on that page is adelphos. That is where we start. The Greek is the first thing you need to understand, and I want to be precise about it. The Greek of the New Testament, Koine Greek, the everyday spoken language of the 1st century Mediterranean world, the language in which every gospel was originally composed, has a specific word for brother, adelphos, and it has a specific word for cousin, anepsios. These are not variants of the same root. They are not interchangeable in ordinary usage. They describe 2 different family relationships, and the language has 2 different words to reflect that distinction clearly. You can verify this in about 30 seconds with any Greek New Testament concordance. Now open Paul's letter to the Colossians, chapter 4, verse 10. Paul writes, "My fellow prisoner Aristarchus sends you his greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas." The Greek word Paul uses there for cousin is anepsios, the same Paul who writes in his letter to the Galatians about meeting James the Lord's brother. The same Paul, in the same body of letters, uses anepsios when he means cousin, and adelphos when he means brother. He knew the difference. He used the difference. He applied it apparently without deliberation, the way any native speaker applies the right word for the right relationship. Mark chapter 6 uses adelphos. Matthew chapter 13 uses adelphos. Galatians chapter 1, the earliest written source we have, uses adelphos. The Greek word for cousin exists in the New Testament. It is used in the New Testament. It is used in the same letters by the same author, who calls James the Lord's brother. They chose not to use it for Jesus' family. I want to be careful here, because this is where the argument is often bypassed in favor of getting to the controversy faster. The cousin interpretation does not rest on the Greek being ambiguous. It rests on the claim that adelphos, which in standard Koine Greek means blood brother, was sometimes used more loosely in a Jewish Aramaic cultural context to mean relative in a broader sense. This is the best available argument for the cousin interpretation. I want to give it to you fairly and completely. The problem is that this claim requires you to explain why the same New Testament authors, who had anepsios available and demonstrably used it when they meant cousin, reached consistently for adelphos when describing Jesus' family. If they were writing in a Jewish cultural context where adelphos functioned as a flexible term for relatives, you would expect some variation, some uses of anepsios, some uses of adelphos, an inconsistency that might suggest ambiguity. You would not expect every source across 40 years of writing and multiple independent authors to use adelphos without exception. At the moment in the text where the distinction matters most, the authors made a choice. The word they chose was blood brother. The outside confirmation comes from a man who had no reason to give it. Flavius Josephus was a Jewish historian, born in Jerusalem around 37 CE. He lived through the Jewish-Roman War, surrendered to the Romans, and spent the rest of his life in Rome writing histories intended for a Roman-educated audience. He was not a Christian. He had no theological investment in any claim about Jesus or his family. His job was to record events as he understood them, the succession of priests and governors, the political calculations of Judean factions, the legal controversies and executions, and power struggles of the period. In his Antiquities of the Jews, written around 93 or 94 CE, more than 30 years after the event he describes, Josephus records the execution of James in 62 AD. The high priest Ananus, he writes, convened the Sanhedrin and brought before them James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, and some others. He called the assembly illegal. Ananus had convened the court without the authorization of the Roman governor. The Pharisees objected. Ananus was eventually removed from office as a result of the controversy. It is a legal and administrative record. Josephus is describing a judicial dispute about proper procedure, and in that record, embedded in a political account, the phrase is, the brother of Jesus who was called Christ. Josephus uses adelphos. He had no reason to soften the word. There is no Christian doctrinal agenda in his description. He is not making any theological claim about Jesus. He identifies him as the one called Christ, the way you might identify someone as the one they call the rabbi, or the one known as the prophet, as a neutral identifying marker, not a confession of faith. He is recording that a man named James, identified by his relationship to a notable figure, was executed in a legal controversy. The most natural, direct word for that relationship is the word he uses. His brief references to Jesus have been debated by scholars for centuries. Certain passages show signs of later Christian interpolation, and those scholarly debates are real and legitimate. But this passage, the execution of James in 62 AD, the legal controversy over Ananus, is considered by the overwhelming majority of New Testament scholars to be authentic. It is too specific, too embedded in verifiable political history, too embedded in a narrative about Pharisaic legal norms and Roman administrative authority, to be a later insertion by a Christian scribe trying to bolster his tradition. And in it, Josephus uses the same word that Mark and Matthew and Paul all use, independently, across a span of 40 years. Not cousin, not relative, not follower or disciple or associate. Brother. A Jewish historian writing for a Roman audience, with no stake in the doctrinal question, reached for the same Greek word. Josephus had no reason to soften it. He used it anyway. The earliest written source is not a gospel. I want to be careful about chronology here, because the order of composition matters more than most people in the pews ever get told. The Gospel of Mark, the earliest of the 4 canonical Gospels, the one that Matthew and Luke both drew from heavily in composing their own accounts, was written approximately 40 years after the death of Jesus, somewhere around 65 to 70 CE. Matthew and Luke were written roughly a decade later. John was written still later, perhaps around 90 CE. By the time the Gospels were composed, the people who had personally known Jesus in Galilee were mostly gone. Paul's letters predate all of them. Paul writes his letter to the Galatians approximately 55 CE, 15 years before the first Gospel was written, 25 years before Matthew or Luke. Paul is not writing from oral tradition assembled at a distance of 40 years. He is writing as a living member of the movement in the same generation as the events themselves, to communities he knows personally about people he has met. Galatians chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. Paul describes his visit to Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion. He writes, "I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remained with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Read that carefully. Paul went to Jerusalem. He stayed with Peter for 15 days. He met James. He identifies James specifically, not as a disciple, not as a leader of the church, not by his prominence in the community, though he was all of those things. He identifies him by his relationship to Jesus, James the Lord's brother. Paul stood in the same room as this man. He knew who he was looking at. He used adelphos because it was the straightforward word for the person he had met. This is not theological construction worked out decades after the fact. This is a first-generation witness, writing within living memory, describing a meeting with a man he could see and speak with and question directly. Think about that for a second. If James were a cousin, a distant relative, someone connected to Jesus through a different branch of the family, Paul would have known it. He spent 15 days with Peter in Jerusalem. He met James face to face. He was not relying on a second-hand account of the family structure. He was there. He used adelphos. The sources converge in the same direction. Paul in 55 CE, Mark in 70 CE, Matthew in 80 CE, Josephus in 93 CE. 4 different writers in 3 different communities, writing with different purposes and different intended audiences, all use the same word. None of them reach for anepsios. All of them reach for adelphos. That convergence is not an accident. It is the record pointing consistently in one direction. The cousin interpretation has a name, an author, a date, and a motive written in that author's own hand. Jerome was a 4th century Christian scholar, learned, contentious, ferociously energetic, one of the most formidable biblical linguists in the history of the Church. He is best known for producing the Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Bible that became the authoritative text of Western Christianity for over 1,000 years. He knew Greek and Hebrew at a depth that very few of his contemporaries could match. Around 383 CE, a man named Helvidius published a treatise. It argued what any straightforward reading of the Greek text would argue, that adelphos means brother, that the brothers named in the Gospels were the biological children of Mary and Joseph, born after Jesus, and that the church had no textual basis for claiming Mary remained a perpetual virgin throughout her life. Helvidius was correct about the Greek. I want to say that plainly before we go any further. His linguistic argument was sound. He was reading the text the way the text reads. The word was adelphos. The word for cousin was available and was not used. He was doing exactly what Spinoza would have told him to do, trusting the document over the tradition. Jerome responded with a treatise called Adversus Helvidium, against Helvidius. And in that treatise, Jerome makes explicit what was at stake. He does not argue primarily from linguistics. He argues from theology. If Mary had other children after Jesus, she was not eternally virgin. And if she was not eternally virgin, Jerome writes, she held a lower spiritual position than women who had consecrated their celibacy to God. The entire framework of Marian veneration that had been developing through the 3rd and 4th centuries depended on her perpetual virginity. The doctrine required a different reading of adelphos. So Jerome proposed one. He argued that in a Semitic cultural context, adelphos could be used more broadly for half-brothers, step-brothers, or relatives. He drew on Hebrew usage in the Greek translation of the scriptures to show that the term sometimes functioned loosely. His argument was scholarly and sustained and detailed. It was also, as Helvidius had already pointed out, not supported by how the New Testament authors actually used the word, specifically, not supported by the fact that those same authors used anepsios when they meant cousin. Jerome won the debate, not because his Greek was better than Helvidius's Greek, because he had the institutional weight of the church behind him, because he was producing the Latin translation that would define how Western Christianity read the Bible for the next millennium, and because Helvidius was an obscure writer with no lasting institutional backing. Jerome's interpretation became orthodoxy. Helvidius was forgotten. His name survives only in the title of the treatise written against him. I understand that pattern now in a way I could not have understood it 10 years ago. There was a dinner, maybe 2 years back, a gathering of retired teachers from Bearden High School, where I spent 35 years of my life. A colleague from the history department, someone I had shared a faculty lounge with for 2 decades, pulled me aside during the evening. He had heard about the channel. He said it carefully, the way you say something when you are trying to be honest without being cruel. That some people in town thought I had gone too far. That my standing from those 35 years was being reconsidered. He did not say it with any malice. He said it the way a friend delivers information he wishes he did not have to deliver. I stood there for a moment, holding a paper plate with a piece of cake on it, and I thought about Helvidius. Helvidius was correct about the Greek. He is a footnote now. Jerome had the institutions. What Helvidius lost, his standing, his influence, the memory of his name, was not lost because his argument was wrong. It was lost because the institution had more at stake in Jerome's answer than in Helvidius's accuracy. When the institutional cost of being right is high enough, being right is not sufficient protection. That is not ancient history. That is how it works. Jerome did not mistranslate a word. He reinterpreted it, with a name, a date, and a motive written in his own hand. That is not speculation. That is historical record, and it is available to anyone who reads the Adversus Helvidium, which has been in print in one form or another for 1600 years. Spinoza never wrote about the brothers of Jesus. The Tractatus Theologico-Politicus was focused on the Hebrew Pentateuch, on Moses, on the composition of the first 5 books, on the question of what happens when the internal evidence of a text contradicts the tradition's claim about what the text means. He was not addressing 4th century Christological debates or Jerome's translation choices. But the method he built in that work is precisely the method you need here. The Tractatus asks, for every religious text, who wrote this, when, for what purpose, and what does the internal evidence tell us about why one reading came to replace another reading? Not what do we wish the text said. Not what the institution requires it to say in order to preserve a connected doctrine. What does the document itself tell us if we read it the way we would read any other historical document? Apply that method to the question of Jesus' family, and here is what the record shows. James, the man Paul met in Jerusalem in 55 CE, the man Josephus recorded as executed in 62 CE, the man all 4 independent sources called the Lord's brother, led the Jerusalem church from roughly 40 CE until his death. For over 20 years, he was the central figure in the community that had the most direct access to Jesus, not the community in Rome, not the communities Paul was founding across Asia Minor and Greece, the community in Jerusalem, the people from Galilee, the family. James's version of the tradition, the version that came from people who knew Jesus as a child, who watched him grow up, who shared meals with him before any of it began, survived his death and continued in the movement scholars call Ebionite Christianity. Ebionite Christianity held that Jesus was a man, a prophet, a teacher of extraordinary moral clarity and spiritual depth, not the second person of a cosmic trinity, not divine in nature. A human being, fully present in history, whose teachings had the power to transform how you lived and who you became. The tradition of James's Jerusalem community, the tradition with the most direct human access to who Jesus actually was, that tradition said he was human. Paul's tradition said something different. Paul had never met Jesus in the flesh. By his own account in Galatians, his knowledge of Jesus came through a visionary experience, a blinding encounter on a road to Damascus. Paul's theology of Jesus as pre-existent divine being, as cosmic redeemer, as the second Adam who undid what the first Adam had done. This was not the theology James taught in Jerusalem. It was the theology of a man who encountered Jesus in a vision, not in a house in Nazareth. James and Paul disagreed. The letters of Paul and the text of Acts both preserve evidence of the friction between them, over Jewish law, over circumcision, over what the movement was actually for. The question of who Jesus was, at the most fundamental level, was not settled in the first generation. The brother who grew up with him held one view. The man who never met him held another. Spinoza's method asks, when there is an institutional choice between 2 traditions, who benefits from which reading, and what did preserving that reading require? The tradition that required Mary's perpetual virginity could not coexist with 4 named blood brothers. The theology that required Jesus to have been divine from his first breath could not accommodate a biological family that remembered him as a child. And the tradition that came from the family itself, James's tradition, the Ebionite tradition, the tradition of the people who knew him in Nazareth, was precisely the tradition that said he was human. When Jerome reinterpreted adelphos in 383 CE, he was not correcting a grammatical misunderstanding. He was removing the textual foundation of a rival tradition's authority. The brothers of Jesus did not disappear from history quietly. James led the Jerusalem church until 62 CE, when Ananus had him executed in the legal controversy Josephus records. After James, the Jerusalem community continued under leaders drawn from the family of Jesus, relatives, figures the early church called the Desposini, the family of the Lord. The community had a specific continuity, a specific location, a specific memory of who Jesus was in the years before any of it began. The tradition that descended from them, the Ebionite tradition, the tradition of the Jerusalem church, survived into the 4th century. They used a gospel in the Hebrew or Aramaic language, possibly connected to the Logia that Papias records Matthew as having composed. They did not use Paul's letters. They continued to observe Jewish law. They understood Jesus as a fully human prophet who had been designated or adopted by God, most commonly at the moment of his baptism, rather than as a divine being who had taken on human form. After Constantine, when the institutional church had the power of the Roman Empire to enforce its theological decisions, the Ebionites were declared heretics. Their texts were not preserved. Their gospel was not copied. The tradition that came from the family, from the people who were closest to the historical person, who had the least institutional incentive to construct a mythology around him, that tradition was excluded from the canon, condemned by council, and gradually eliminated from the record until almost nothing of it survived. The Desposini sent representatives to Rome in the early 4th century. We have an account of it in a chronicle by Julius Africanus, asking for the return of church properties and the recognition of their family's traditional role in the community. They were turned away. The family of Jesus in the 4th century had no standing in the institution that bore his name. With the brothers reinterpreted as cousins, the connection between Jesus and his family was severed at the textual level. They were no longer brothers. They were distant relatives, peripheral figures, people whose proximity to Jesus gave them no special claim to know what the tradition should say about him. The Desposini lost their theological standing the moment Jerome's interpretation became orthodoxy. It was not enough to win the argument. The textual foundation had to be changed as well, and it was changed with a word, one Greek word occurring 4 times in 2 Gospels, with 4 names attached to it. Adelphos became cousin. The family became footnotes. Spinoza did not tell us to distrust the Bible. He told us to read it. The method of the Tractatus is not skepticism for its own sake. It is not the project of taking apart what people love for the pleasure of watching it come undone. It is the project of reading honestly, following what the document actually says, tracking when readings changed and who changed them and why, allowing the internal evidence to take precedence over the tradition's claim about what the evidence means. Read the text here, and here is what you find. 2 Gospels name 4 brothers of Jesus. Both use adelphos. The New Testament word for cousin is anepsios, used elsewhere in the same letters by the same authors. The earliest written source, Paul in 55 CE, describes James as the Lord's brother in the context of a personal meeting. The most credible external source, Josephus in 93 CE, uses the same word in a document recording a legal execution with no theological investment in the choice. The cousin interpretation does not appear in any Christian text before 383 CE. Its author is Jerome. Its stated motive is the doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity. The connection between those facts is documented in Jerome's own words, in a treatise he wrote in a year we can identify, in response to an argument he could not defeat on linguistic grounds alone. That is not a theory. That is the historical record. I spent 35 years telling students that the most important question you can ask about a historical document is not whether you like what it says. It is whether you are reading what it actually says or whether you are reading what someone, somewhere, with something at stake decided it should say. The text of Mark chapter 6 says adelphos. Matthew chapter 13 says adelphos. Paul in Galatians says adelphos. Josephus says adelphos. The four names are in the text: James, Joses, Simon, Judas. What the institution says began in 383 CE, with a scholar who explained his reasoning in writing. Spinoza's instruction is simple: trust the document over the tradition. When the text and the institution diverge, find out when they diverged and ask why. This one diverged in 383 CE. The why is written in Jerome's hand. That's the truth of it.